Get out. Now. My father's voice was steady, too steady. It didn't sound like the man who used to tuck me in at night or tell me how proud he was. It was as if someone had replaced him with a stranger, someone I didn't recognize. I stood frozen in place, my legs feeling like they had turned to stone. The weight of his words slammed into me like a wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, but my father's eyes, cold and unblinking, kept me anchored in place. What? Dad, I don't understand. What do you mean? I stammered, my voice cracking as the panic started to set in. I had been living with them for almost 8 years. They weren't just my foster parents. They were all I had ever known. I thought everything was fine. Sure, they had their quirks. Mom was always too busy with work, and Dad, well, Dad had his temper. But we were a family, right? You're an adult now, and you need to start acting like one. We've done enough for you. He didn't even look at me, just kept staring at the wall as if the words were slipping out without any real meaning. What? You've done enough for me? You've done everything for me, and I'm supposed to just what? Pay you back? How? How am I supposed to pay you back? I don't even have a job. I felt the rage boil up inside me, the unfairness of it all. I wanted to scream, but something about my father's calm demeanor made me hesitate. It was like a slap in the face that was somehow worse than any shouting match we'd ever had. My mother, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, finally spoke up, her voice low but steady. You're 18 soon. It's time to grow up. We've given you everything, food, shelter, even the school fees. Now it's your turn. You need to start paying for your own life. Her words were calm, but there was no softness in them. No affection, no warmth. Just cold, detached logic. Are you kidding me? You can't just throw me out like this. I'm a kid. I'm still a kid. I tried to find my balance, but my legs were shaky, like they were about to give out under me. My throat tightened, and I had to swallow the lump that had formed. I looked between my parents, hoping to see something that would tell me this wasn't real, that they didn't mean it. But no, their faces were set, determined. They were serious. Listen, we've been doing this for a long time. You were given everything you needed. A roof over your head, a place to call home. You don't get to stay here anymore without contributing to the household. We've already been talking about this. It's time for you to pay your way, my father said, his voice firm. There was no hint of the father I knew, the one who used to wrap me in a hug when I was scared of storms or tell me how I was the best thing that ever happened to them. That man was gone, replaced by this stranger who was treating me like I was just a burden. I couldn't believe it. But what about school? What about everything? You can't just throw me out and expect me to figure it all out. The words spilled out, desperate and frantic. It's not our problem anymore, my mother said, her voice soft but final. You're an adult now. Time to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I wanted to scream, to punch something, but all I could do was stare at them. My parents, who had promised to care for me until I was grown, were now turning their backs on me. The very people who had fought so hard to get me out of the system, to give me stability, had just decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. Where am I supposed to go? The words slipped out before I could stop them. My voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of it hit me harder than anything. Where was I supposed to go? You'll figure it out, my father replied, standing up and walking toward the door. You'll manage. Everyone has to learn how to survive on their own eventually. I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to shrink around me, and the floor felt like it was falling away. I had no plan, no way to get by. I had just turned 18, and I was about to be thrown into the world with nothing. I wanted to shout, to beg them to reconsider, but something inside me snapped. If they weren't going to help me, then I'd have to help myself. Somehow. But first, I needed to survive the next few minutes. Fine, I muttered, barely able to hear myself. I'll figure it out. But don't expect me to be grateful for this. My father didn't even look back as he left the room. My mother just stood there, arms crossed, as if she was waiting for me to do something, anything, that would prove I was ready to handle this on my own. The door closed with a finality that echoed in the empty room. I was alone now, alone in a house that used to be mine, but no longer felt like home. The first night I spent outside of that house felt like a cold punch to the gut. I didn't have anywhere to go, so I ended up walking around for hours, my mind racing with a million thoughts. I couldn't even remember how I ended up in the park, sitting on a bench in the dark, trying to keep warm by pulling my jacket tighter around myself. It wasn't exactly freezing, but the chill in the air made it hard to think straight. All I could hear was the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves. The world felt massive, and I was this tiny speck, lost in it. I didn't know what I expected to happen. Maybe I thought someone would come looking for me, or maybe I thought everything would magically get better. But nothing happened. No one came. I was alone. I should have known, but I was too stunned by everything to think clearly. By morning, I was exhausted, my body aching from the night spent sitting still on a bench. I walked around, trying to find a place to sleep, to eat. The idea of going to a shelter crossed my mind, but I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to be surrounded by strangers in a place where I could barely even trust myself. I had spent my whole life being told I had a home, a place to belong, and now that was gone. My stomach growled. I had no money, no job, nothing. I could barely think straight. I eventually ended up sitting outside a coffee shop, watching people walk by, their lives continuing as if everything was normal. They had routines, families, jobs. They belonged somewhere. I didn't. I hadn't realized how much I had relied on the comfort of knowing I had a place in this world. I was starting to see how naive I had been to think things would just work out. By late afternoon, I got a text from my mom. "I hope you figured out what you need to do by now. You can't keep running away from your responsibilities." I stared at the screen, the words cutting deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just the message, but the fact that she had sent it. It was as if they were watching me, making sure I suffered the consequences of their decision. I wanted to yell at her. I wanted to tell her how much they had destroyed everything. Instead, I just threw my phone on the ground and crushed it under my heel. I didn't want to hear from them anymore. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. I didn't know how long I stood there, numb, trying to think of what I could possibly do. I was barely 18, and I had never been in a position like this before. I had no idea what it meant to survive on my own. I'd never had to. Sure, I'd helped around the house, cleaned, made dinner sometimes, but my entire life had been controlled by them. They gave me everything I needed, and now they were forcing me to fend for myself. I didn't even know where to start. I made my way back to the park later that evening, still not sure what I was doing or where I was going. It felt like the whole world had moved on without me. I couldn't even bring myself to call my friends. Who would help me? They all had their own lives, their own families. They wouldn't understand. And honestly, I wasn't sure I could explain it. I couldn't admit how much it hurt. I was just about to sit down again when a voice interrupted me. "You all right?" I turned around quickly, startled. There was a guy standing behind me. He was older than me, probably in his mid-20s. He had dark, messy hair and a beat-up leather jacket, and I could tell by his eyes that he wasn't some random stranger asking if I needed directions. He looked like he'd seen his own share of problems. "I'm fine," I said, standing up, not wanting to admit how lost I felt. "You sure?" he pressed, stepping a little closer. "You're sitting here all by yourself, looking like you're in some kind of trouble." "I'm just thinking," I said, trying to brush it off, but he didn't back down. "I've been there," he said. "Don't know why you're out here, but I'm not going to pretend I don't see it. You're not fine." He paused, like he was waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, he added, "If you're in trouble, you can talk to me. I'm not going to judge you." I wasn't used to strangers being that direct, especially in a place like this. The whole situation felt unreal. But something in his voice made me stop. I hesitated for a moment, then dropped my shoulders and sighed. I just got kicked out of my house." He nodded as if he expected that. "Yeah, I've seen that before." I was caught off guard by his response. "What do you mean?" "I'm not saying I know what you're going through, but I've been there. It's tough. I've lived on the streets a few times myself. It's hard to keep your head above water, but it's not impossible." I stared at him, uncertain. He didn't seem like someone who was here to give me pity or offer some false hope. "I don't know what to do. I don't even have a place to stay." "You got anyone to turn to?" he asked, his voice softer now. "No," I said, shaking my head. "My parents, they kicked me out. They just don't care." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's rough. Parents aren't supposed to do that." He glanced around and then looked at me again. "Look, I know a place where you can crash for a while. It's not great, but it'll keep you off the streets. You can figure things out from there." For the first time that day, I felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't all lost. Maybe I wasn't completely alone. "I don't know. I don't want to owe anyone anything," I said, still unsure. I didn't trust easily, especially not after what my parents had just done to me. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, his eyes meeting mine. Sometimes, people just need help. No strings attached. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but in that moment, it didn't feel like I had a choice. All right, I said, taking a deep breath. I'll go. And just like that, I followed him into the unknown, not sure what was waiting for me, but knowing that whatever it was, it couldn't be worse than what I had left behind. I followed him down a narrow alley, the dim streetlights barely illuminating our path. My feet felt heavy, like I was walking deeper into a world I had no business being in. I tried to tell myself that this was just temporary, that I was just taking one step after another, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being completely out of place. We stopped in front of an old building that looked like it had seen better days. The windows were covered in grime, and the paint on the door was peeling, but it didn't look dangerous. At least, not in the way the streets did. There was a sense of quiet here, as if this place had learned how to be invisible. He turned to me, his face a little softer now. "This is it," he said, pulling a key from his pocket and unlocking the door. He pushed it open and gestured for me to go in first. I hesitated, but there was no turning back now. I stepped inside, the creaky floorboards groaning under my feet. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time, but it was warm. That small comfort was enough to make my body relax, just a little. The place looked like an old warehouse that had been converted into living space. There were mismatched furniture pieces scattered around, the kind of stuff you'd find at a yard sale, but it had a strange, lived-in feel to it. There were a few people sitting on the couch, talking quietly, but no one paid much attention to me. They all looked tired, like they were just passing through too. "This is where I stay," the guy said, closing the door behind us. "It's not much, but it's safe. No one's gonna bother you here." "Who else lives here?" I asked, looking around. There was a woman sitting in the corner, scribbling something in a notebook. A man, probably in his 40s, was leaning against the wall, looking out the window. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his eyes on me all the same. "Just a few of us," he said, his tone casual. "We help each other out. You'll get used to it." I didn't know what I expected. Maybe I thought it would be some kind of shelter, with rules and people constantly checking on you. This wasn't like that. It felt more like a secret, a hidden world where people went when they had nowhere else to turn. I wasn't sure if I belonged here, but I didn't have any other options. I had been running on empty for days, and the fact that I could sleep without fear of being tossed out onto the street again felt like a luxury. But as I stood there, taking in my surroundings, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. These people were all in it together, and I was just someone who had stumbled in out of desperation. "You can crash on the couch," the guy said, pointing to a threadbare sofa near the back of the room. "There's food in the kitchen if you need it. I'll grab you some water." He disappeared into the other room, and I took a seat on the couch, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about how I had ended up here, about the life I had left behind. I had always been so focused on making it through high school, on keeping my head down, doing what I was supposed to do. And for what? To end up here, in a place that felt like it was on the edge of everything. I tried to breathe, to slow my mind down. But it was hard. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. What was I supposed to do now? How was I supposed to rebuild a life from scratch when I didn't even have a starting point? The guy came back with a glass of water and handed it to me, his face serious now. "Look, I know this isn't the best situation," he said, sitting down next to me. "But it's better than being out there, right? You can stay here as long as you need to. You'll figure it out." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed him. What was I even supposed to figure out? How was I supposed to go from being someone's child to this? A kid who had nowhere to go, no one to rely on but myself. I didn't know if I could do it. "We've all been there," the guy said, breaking through my thoughts. "You're not the first to end up in a place like this. Hell, I didn't have anywhere to go when I first got here. You think it's easy? But you can make it. It's not about where you start. It's about how you handle it." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. There was a hardness in his eyes, a sort of resignation that only came from experience. I didn't know what his story was, but I could see that he had been through his own version of hell. Maybe this place wasn't so different after all. Maybe we were all just trying to make it through. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "For helping me." He shrugged, his expression unreadable. No one's gonna help you unless you let them. That's what I learned. I'm not saying it's gonna be easy. It's never easy. But you'll make it. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the truth was, I didn't know if I was strong enough to handle it all. The anger I felt toward my parents was still there, a constant weight in my chest. They had kicked me out without a second thought, without any warning, and now I was stuck trying to figure out how to survive. It wasn't fair. I didn't deserve this. But then again, life wasn't fair. I had learned that much already. As the night wore on, I found myself talking to the people in the room, asking questions, trying to get a feel for what my life was going to look like now. I didn't know if this was where I was supposed to be, but for the first time in days, I felt like I had a small piece of stability. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could make it through this after all. The days blurred together in the small, dimly lit warehouse. I didn't know if I was surviving or just getting by. Each morning felt like a struggle to keep my head above water. The people around me weren't exactly strangers anymore, but they were still hard to trust. They all had their own battles, their own pasts. They didn't ask for mine, and I didn't offer it. I did what I had to do, helped with the dishes, swept the floor, kept to myself. But the anger, the confusion from being kicked out, never really went away. It simmered beneath the surface, eating at me. One night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of everything was too much. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of the others settling in for the night. I should have been grateful for the roof over my head, but the truth was, I was exhausted. Physically, emotionally, mentally, I was running on fumes. The idea of calling my parents, of hearing their voices, crossed my mind, but it felt impossible. How could I talk to them after what they did? After they had just tossed me aside like I didn't matter? I heard someone moving around in the kitchen and sat up. It was the guy who had helped me when I first got there. He had been around less lately, too preoccupied with whatever his own problems were. I pushed myself up, the floor creaking beneath me, and went to see what he was doing. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw him sitting at the table, his head in his hands, elbows resting on the tabletop. I had never seen him like this before. Usually, he was the one giving advice, offering help. But now he looked lost. I didn't know what to say at first. The silence stretched between us for a few moments before he spoke, his voice quiet, but filled with something heavier than I had ever heard from him. "Did you ever think your life would turn out like this?" he asked, his words hanging in the air like a question neither of us had an answer for. "No," I said, sitting across from him. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I'd be fine." "We all think that," he replied, his eyes hard but tired. "You think you've got it under control until everything falls apart. Then you're left picking up the pieces, trying to figure out where you went wrong." "I didn't do anything wrong," I shot back, almost without thinking. "I didn't ask for any of this. They're the ones who kicked me out." He looked at me, his expression softening a little. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't deserve it. But sometimes, it's not about what you deserve. It's about what life hands you, and what you choose to do with it." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. His words were too calm, too reasonable, but they hit harder than anything my parents had said. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, but I didn't want to show it. "So what? I'm just supposed to accept it? Just roll over and move on? Is that what you're saying?" "No, I'm not saying that," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "I'm saying that sometimes you don't have control over the things that happen to you, but you do have control over how you deal with it. You can stay angry, you can stay stuck, or you can make a change." I laughed bitterly, running my hand through my hair. "It's not that simple. It's not like I can just forget what they did." "I'm not asking you to forget," he said, his voice steady. "But if you let that anger control you, it'll tear you apart. You have to decide what matters more, holding on to the pain or moving forward." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to shout at him, to tell him he had no idea what it was like to be discarded by the people who were supposed to care for you. I wanted to scream that nothing in my life had been fair, and I didn't deserve any of this. But I didn't. I just sat there, feeling something inside me start to shift. "You know, I thought I had nothing left," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "I thought when they kicked me out, that was it. I thought I had no family, no one who cared about me. But now I feel like I'm just fading away. I'm not even sure who I am anymore." "You're not fading away," he said softly, meeting my eyes. "You're just starting over. It's not easy, and it's not fair. But you don't have to figure it all out right now. You've got time, and you've got people who are here for you." I wanted to believe him, but part of me still felt like I was walking through a fog, just stumbling through the motions. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate his help. It was just that the world felt too big, too overwhelming for someone like me to make a mark on. The next day, things took a turn. The guy told me that he had a lead on a job opportunity, something I could do part-time to start building some income. I didn't know if I was ready for it, but I also knew I couldn't keep going like this. The anger, the frustration, it had built up over the days and weeks, and it was starting to crush me. I couldn't keep hiding in the shadows. He introduced me to the person who ran the job, an old acquaintance of his who had connections in a local restaurant. They needed a dishwasher, nothing glamorous, but it was a start. I went in that afternoon, and despite my nerves, I managed to get the job. I came back to the warehouse that evening, feeling a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in weeks. I had done something. I had taken a step. It wasn't much, but it was mine. When I walked in, I found the guy waiting for me. His eyes were calm, but there was a flicker of something in them. "You got it, huh?" "Yeah," I said, feeling a mix of pride and relief. "I got it." He smiled for the first time in days. "Good. You're gonna make it." For the first time in a long while, I believed him. The weeks after getting the job passed in a blur of noise, clanking dishes, and the low hum of conversation in the restaurant kitchen. It wasn't glamorous by any means, but it was a routine I could count on, something to focus on that wasn't the mess of my life. I woke up early each morning, went to work, came back to the warehouse, and did it all over again. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place, but I never let myself forget how much I had lost in the process. The anger that had been a constant companion in the beginning started to settle into something else, emptiness. I didn't have the luxury of time to process everything that had happened. I just kept moving, kept going forward, even though I wasn't sure where I was heading. One night, after finishing a shift that had dragged on longer than usual, I made my way back to the warehouse, exhausted but satisfied. I was starting to get the hang of things. The first few weeks had been brutal, learning new systems, figuring out the timing of everything, and trying to keep my head above water in a new environment. But now, I was more in control. The anxiety that had plagued me in the beginning, the feeling that I was barely holding it together, was starting to fade. When I opened the door to the warehouse, I expected it to be the usual, quiet and empty except for a few people scattered around. But tonight was different. There were a few faces I didn't recognize, and a tension hung in the air that made me pause in the doorway. The guy who had helped me when I first got here, the one who had shown me the ropes, was standing by the table, talking to someone in a low voice. I hesitated, unsure if I should interrupt, but he noticed me right away. He gave me a quick, tight smile, and then excused himself from the conversation. He walked over to me, his face serious. "Hey, we need to talk." I felt a lump form in my throat. "What's going on?" "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice a little too calm, like he was trying to hide something. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm not sure how you're going to take it, but you need to know." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Just tell me." He paused, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "It's about the job. The guy who owns the restaurant, the one who hired you, he's not what he seems. I've been working there longer than I've told you, and I've seen things. Things that make me think he's not just helping people out like he says he is." My mind was spinning. I didn't know what he was talking about. "What do you mean? What things?" The guy lowered his voice. "He's not running a clean business. He uses the place to cover up some other stuff that's not legal. I didn't want to tell you this, but I can't keep quiet anymore. You've been doing well, and I don't want you to get caught up in something you can't get out of." I stood there, trying to process his words. My heart started to pound. I had been so focused on keeping my head down, on making it through each day, that I hadn't even thought about what was going on behind the scenes. What should I do? He shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "I don't know. I don't want to scare you, but you need to be careful. It's not just about getting a paycheck. You've got to be aware of what's going on around you." I felt a wave of anger and confusion hit me all at once. I had already been kicked out by my parents, already left with nothing. Now, it felt like the world was trying to knock me down again. So what now? Am I supposed to just quit? Walk away from the only job I have? I don't know. I'm just telling you what I know. You've got to decide what's worth the risk. But you're not alone in this. If you want out, I'll help you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to scream, to run away and never look back. But that wasn't an option. Not anymore. I had come too far to just let everything collapse again. "I don't know what to do," I said, feeling the weight of the decision settling on me like a rock. You don't have to decide right now, he said. Just think about it. But I'm telling you, things aren't as simple as they seem. I spent the next few days stewing over what he'd told me. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to face the reality that the one thing I had managed to secure, a job, some sense of stability, could turn out to be just another trap. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were signs I had ignored. The way the owner's eyes always seemed to shift when certain people walked in. The odd conversations that stopped the second I entered the room. I didn't want to accept it, but I knew he was right. So I did what I had to do. I went to work, kept my head down, and stayed alert. I didn't let anyone see that I was suspicious, that I was starting to put the pieces together. But inside, I was thinking ahead. I wasn't going to let myself get pulled into something dangerous, even if it meant giving up everything I had worked for. And just like that, my life was at a crossroads again. I had to choose what mattered more, survival or my integrity. I didn't know if I was strong enough to walk away, but I knew I had to try. I wasn't going to end up like my parents, throwing away everything for the sake of convenience. I wasn't going to let the world swallow me whole, no matter how many times it tried. The next few days were filled with tension as I weighed my options. But in the end, I made my choice. I walked into the restaurant one afternoon and quit. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it. The risk was too great, and my peace of mind meant more than any paycheck. It was a bitter victory, though. I didn't have a plan B. I had burned a bridge, and I had no idea what would come next. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had a grip on my own future again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clear, but it was mine.